Welcome into a midweek edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com. Hope you are enjoying your week so far. Chilly week, at least around my part of the country, Kentuckiana area. I'm sure if you're living in Indiana, you are feeling much of the same or similar temperatures. But maybe you live down south. Maybe you live out west and you're experiencing something a whole lot more palatable if you're not a fan of the cold weather. Wherever you are, I hope you're enjoying yourself. Sit back, relax, enjoy the next however long this episode ends up being. Usually ends up somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour. And, grab yourself a cup of coffee or a spot of tea, as I said, I think yesterday, maybe. And, like I said, enjoy yourself. Going to have Drew Rosenberg on here to talk Indiana basketball as well as the NBA here in a little bit. It's been a while since we've had Mr. Rosenberg on In Touch with Indiana Sports. Looking forward to that. And then elsewhere, we're going to react a little more to what happened on the floor with Indiana basketball last night against the Sam Houston Bearcats. Also going to react to the college football playoff rankings, the penultimate rankings, and kind of share my thoughts on not only where Indiana landed, but how the rest of the field shaped out and what to expect moving ahead to Championship Saturday, and then what may happen after the fact, because there's a numerous amount of results that could take place on Saturday that may shuffle some things one way or another. So we'll save the rest of that conversation for later. And then also something I haven't done in a while, and it's my own fault for not doing it. It's getting to your YouTube comments. I'm going to go back through the last several episodes and highlight some of the comments that, give me some things to talk about, some things to react to, your questions, comments, concerns, whatever it may be. And if you want to do that, participate in that, you can do so on this episode, previous episodes, next episodes, whatever it may be. Just let me know what you want to weigh in on, and I may react to it on the show. And you can also do something that I don't utilize very often, simply because there's not a lot of people who do like to use this method. But you can also call into the show, leave a voicemail at 502-830-9195 if you want to have your voice heard on the show. I do wish that was something I was able to use more often, but honestly, in this format, maybe that is not the ideal way to do stuff. I mean, there's a reason there's a YouTube comment section. So, and then one last thing before we move forward, I just want to mention this because it's something that bothers me. Maybe it's not something that bothers you guys who are listening or watching, whatever it may be, but I do want to address it just because if it was me as the viewer or listener and I was relying on the show to come out at a certain time each and every week and it was different, that would maybe bother me. And so that's why I want to address this and really just kind of apologize for the not missing episodes or inconsistency of posting episodes, but really just the inconsistency of when it posts. And again, maybe this isn't that big of a deal. And I say that because today's episode has more than likely been released a bit later than normal. And it's just because my duties with my new job are way more, not only are they different, but I have so many other things I have to take care of, even from here now. When I get home from my heart, there are things on occasion that I have to take care of before I'm able to get to doing this show. And again, I don't want to wallow in my own sorrow for too much longer, but like, I will say this, one thing that I've noticed different with this show since I've moved shifts is that I feel, I don't feel like the show has suffered too much. At least I hope it hasn't. I try to tell myself that it hasn't. But I miss waking up and this being the first thing that I do. Right. And now, again, for those of you who've been following along, like now I get up at 3:45 in the morning, Monday through Friday. And I love what I do, even though the shift has changed. And, it's an early rise. There's good and bad that comes with it. But, there's something about coming home and wanting to kind of just settle down. And, I feel like it's already time to unplug. Whereas previously, the first, 40 to 50 episodes were fairly, I don't know, I feel like the energy was different. So hopefully maybe I'm just in my own head with it and it's not that big of a deal. But as always, appreciate the listen. And hopefully the things I just mentioned don't bother you too much, because as long as I'm able, I'm still going to be here, still going to be doing these Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And I look forward to each and every one of those coming up. So take a swig of coffee and then we'll get rolling here. I want to start off with my quick thoughts on last night's game between Indiana and Sam Houston, and we'll get into that as well as a few other things more in detail with Drew Rosenberg when he joins us here shortly. And you can also check out my conversation with Kyler Staley on our post game wrap up from last night as well. If you missed any of that, to hear kind of our immediate thoughts on what happened between Indiana and Sam Houston. Of course, the Hoosiers get the 97-71 victory, getting back in the win column for not the first time since the Bahamas, but their first time since returning back to Simon Scott Assembly Hall, the friendly confines, if you will. And a lot of good stuff last night. Good to see the guards kind of bounce back after having a not so good week in Atlantis, and in particular Miles Rice leading the way with 19 points. Also had good showings from Luke Goody, being really kind of the Luke Goody game, if we will. And 5 from 7 from the 3-point line. And one of the big talking points leading up to the game last night was thinking about how, when Luke Goody was going to really have his moment. And he did that in an emphatic way last night with his career high 18 points. Of course, 5 3-pointers, as I mentioned earlier, and then a few free throws to go along with that. So good to see him make an impact and knowing that he wants to be the best shooter in the Big Ten, if he isn't already. And if he can become a consistent weapon for Indiana throughout the coming weeks and months of this college basketball season, that will add, something that we've talked about earlier, already this season, just a weapon that we haven't really seen from the perimeter in a long time. And I know Indiana's had some good players over the last couple of seasons, but it feels like it's been a really long time since you could pinpoint one specific guy on the roster that you knew if they were going to pull up from three that they were automatic. And some of that is, due to the style that Indiana plays, and they're just not shooting a whole lot of 3-pointers last night, 7 for 15. I mean, that's a good percentage, 46.7%. When you look at the score and you don't think about the opponent that they were playing last night, 97-71. I mean, that's, if you can do the things that you did on offense on a consistent basis, no matter who the opponent is, I don't think it matters how many 3-pointers you're taking. Because what you also got last night was Malik Renew, 18 points, not a single 3-point attempt. And I know Malik Renew, there's days where he will shoot threes and days where he won't. You're more than likely never going to see Umar Ballo stepping out behind the perimeter, and there would be no reason for him to. And then you have Mackenzie Mbako, who's kind of this hybrid. He's kind of a do-it-all guy, right? He can slash, he can shoot the three, he can really do anything you ask him to do when he puts forth his best effort. He got you 13 points last night, 1 3-pointer, missed 3 of them as well, but perfect from the line, 2 for 2. Just a really kind of good overall performance from most of your guys. And of course, you're still getting contributions from your freshman Bryson Tucker with 8 points. And to have him come off the bench and do what he's doing, I think he's already ahead of schedule. I don't think a lot of people knew what to expect when it came to Bryson Tucker and what he may be able to offer Indiana as a freshman. When you knew they were bringing in all this talent from the transfer portal that was veterans and, guys who are expected to make an immediate impact. We always thought Bryson Tucker would be a wild card. And I think he's probably not too far off from having, his Luke Goody game, right? Where he comes in and just having his moment. I don't even know why I just referred to the Luke Goody game as if that's a universal term. He'll have the Bryson Tucker game, right? Who knows if that comes against Miami of Ohio this Friday. Maybe it's in one of the Big Ten matchups next week, or maybe it's in January whenever things are really rolling. One of the old sayings is once you get into the new calendar year in basketball, your freshmen, especially your highly touted freshmen, are no longer considered, freshmen anymore. They're expected to have already learned from some of the silly mistakes they've been making, and they're never going to be perfect. But it's already looking good for Bryson Tucker as he's had a really good showing, not only last night, but through most of the first several outings of Indiana's season. And it is nice to talk positively about Indiana basketball right now because when you move back nearly a week from today, I guess it was a week from today. We were about, I guess, if you go exactly 7 days on this Wednesday, at least at the moment that I'm recording this. This is currently 11:40 a.m. When you're listening to this, it won't be the case. It'll actually be after what I'm about to mention happened. And that was when you faced Louisville at noon on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and you got humbled. That's just the nice way to put it. And a lot of people, including myself, were wondering, like, okay, what happens next? And then you ended up having an opportunity against a Gonzaga team that also unexpectedly lost, not in the same way that Indiana did, of course. And then they handed Indiana another blowout loss. And from then there was a really bad energy around, the fan base, and rightfully so. And it seemed like whatever Indiana did the next day against Providence, was it really going to matter? And I don't know if you guys can hear that, but there is a car horn out next to me, or so where I'm at recording this. There is a wall to my left, and there is a driveway basically right next to where I'm recording. And thankfully the car horn stopped, but hopefully nobody was breaking in. I live in a pretty nice, relatively speaking. I'm not rich, obviously. I live in a safe neighborhood. We'll put it that way. And now that I'm stun locked, where do I move from here? I know we were talking about Indiana basketball and the different play. Oh yeah, I was going kind of recapping where the mood was during the battle for Atlantis. And a lot of, even though we were talking about the Providence game specifically, and it felt like, at least for some people, most people, I was kind of like, okay, are we going to react to what happens here? Because at that point, you're playing to not be last, right? You and Providence, I say Indiana and Providence, were the only two to not win a game so far, and you're just trying not to be the team that doesn't win a game, period. And Providence had played 12 hours prior because they had the late game. Indiana had the early game, or in just an earlier game. And then Indiana comes up. You face a Providence team that's tired, right? And so to get the result they did, it was fine. And I will say, Kyler Staley has been the positive, he's been the positive voice, I guess, amongst us Hoosier Illustrated members, writers, staff members, whatever you want to call us. And sometimes that's easier said than done. But for him to kind of just be like, you know what, I see the potential in this team. Let's be a little more patient. I know things got really bad at some point last year, but let's not assume that this team is going to go down in that exact same direction this time around. And I tend to have a pretty positive outlook as well. But for some reason, and this may not be the best comparison, but it's the comparison that I like to use. Now that I've seen what good coaching for an Indiana football team looks like, I tend to compare that to what's going on with the Indiana basketball program. And it makes it really easy to criticize when things are going wrong with Mike Woodson and his team, because when you get moments where the team looks unfocused or unprepared, and you think about what you've been watching all season long with the football team, it makes you wonder, like, okay, there's clearly two different sides to this coin right here. Somebody really has, their process and things figured out, and the other coach doesn't. And again, I don't want to look too far deep into that, but it's just something that has crossed my mind a time or two. So we'll continue this conversation here on the other side with Drew Rosenberg from HoosierIllustrated.com. We're also going to talk a little NBA. Haven't done that in a while, and figured it'd be a good time to go and check in on what's going on in the association. So without further ado, from HoosierIllustrated.com, Drew Rosenberg. Welcome back to Mr. Drew Rosenberg on In Touch with Indiana Sports. It's been a bit since we've had you on, but I'm glad you're back on, my friend.
Yeah, I was going to say lots happened, Indiana sports, NBA, it's been doesn't feel that long, but then looking back, it's probably been a couple weeks at least.
I know there's so many things going on, really in the entirety of sports. Obviously now Major League Baseball's done, which is fine. I don't really have any thoughts on MLB ever in general. I'm just not a baseball guy, because everybody talks about that famed period in sports where it's the end of October. It's like, oh my gosh, everything's going on at the same time. Basketball, football, baseball. I'm just like, I don't watch baseball. At least I don't anymore. I did a little bit more whenever I was younger, but as you get older, what I've learned is that there's so many other things that your mind wants to focus on. You kind of have to start eliminating stuff, and baseball is one of those things for me.
No, I'm in kind of similar boat. I mean, I'll watch baseball when my team is good. I'm all in. When they're bad, I'm half in. So it's kind of
who is your team?
I'm a Red Sox fan, so right now, kind of hoping they can land Juan Soto. But
oh yeah, I forgot you're a Boston guy. That's why you're a Celtics dude too. Forgot about that.
Yeah,
but we're gonna get into a little bit of NBA stuff again here in just a few minutes. But I do want to talk a little bit more about Indiana basketball. I was just giving my own thoughts on kind of what's gone on in these first few weeks of the season, and then what happened last night with Sam Houston, kind of getting back on the right track. I guess I'll start with this, Drew. What are kind of your overall thoughts? If I would have told you that this is where Indiana basketball would have been at this point, you had a pretty weak showing in the Bahamas. You did get one win out of it. That's kind of, I don't want to call it a gimme because they did have to show up after having two really bad performances before that. And then on top of that, you've taken care of business outside of the Bahamas. So if I told you that this is what had happened with Indiana basketball before the season, what do you think your reaction would have been?
I don't think I'd be surprised just because there's so many new pieces on this team, and there is the talent. The talent's obviously there. I mean, we've seen it. We see Miles Rice, Cannon Carlisle, Umar Ball all perform elsewhere. Bryson Tucker's a top recruit. Mackenzie Mbako, Renew were key players last year. It's one of those things. It's just finding that fit, and it's going to take time. The best teams in college basketball today aren't always going to be the best teams come February. So it's one of those things. It's so early in the season. I think 8 games in, and that Louisville performance was rough. It was rough performance, but it's one of those things. It's one game in November that come February, March, this team finds a way to, finish at the top of the Big Ten or close to the top of the Big Ten. We're not going to even remember that game.
And one thing on that Louisville team specifically, and I've noticed it a few times this year, just because I'm in the Louisville area and I kind of follow them along, not as my secondary team. I'm not a fan of them by any stretch of the imagination. And honestly, it was very embarrassing to have to just see people online that were friends of mine and colleagues of mine get, just kind of not blast Indiana, but, have their fun with the game that was taking place. But one thing I've learned that makes me sort of think that Louisville game, there may have been some flukiness to it, is that the Louisville team that Indiana played is very streaky. They rely very heavily on making three-point shots and just offensive momentum in general. And if that's what they want to do and they're succeeding, then that's all fine and dandy. Credit to them. And, Indiana should have had an answer to stop them. Mm-hmm. But when Louisville's not hitting shots, I mean, they got blown out by Tennessee, who Indiana beat. They just got blown out by Ole Miss last night by 23 points. And it makes you wonder, is that Louisville team that beat Indiana, are they as good as they were, or was that kind of a fluky win for them?
It's one of those things. I think it's a little bit of both. I think, Louisville, they had a bad loss Tuesday night. I'm blanking against who, but Ole Miss. They got killed by Ole Miss.
Yeah.
But, Keyshawn Pryor didn't play, and he is a key contributor. I mean, we saw it against Indiana. He was one of the best players on the floor for them. I think it's a mix of both, though. Indiana played a bad game. You have 23 turnovers. You give up at least 11 offensive rebounds. You're not going to win many games, especially against a Power 4 school doing those things. Combined with the fact Indiana's not the, most aggressive in shooting the three ball versus Louisville is the team that wants to shoot threes. Indiana has guys like Mackenzie Mbako. We saw Luke Goody against Sam Houston. They're capable of hitting threes. It's just they don't want their identity to be the 3-point from beyond the arc like Louisville. So finding that balance when you're giving up these extra possessions, these extra shots, and making those, unforced turnovers, it makes it even harder to beat when that team is shooting a lot more threes.
And honestly, I think Indiana's performance against Sam Houston, even though it was definitely a lesser opponent, it's a nice blueprint of what a successful win should look like for this style of Indiana team. They're 7 for 15 from the 3-point line. It's a great percentage, but it's not a high volume. If you're doing that and everything else is going right, like I mentioned this earlier, Malik Renew had 18 points. None of them came from beyond the arc. Whenever you have that complementary style of offense where it's tough to defend you from the 3-point line and inside, that's obviously, it probably even goes without saying, that's the recipe for Indiana to have success throughout this season.
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's finding that balance. Last year, there wasn't any of that balance. I mean, we saw it. Indiana could score inside the paint. Khalil Ware could, finish the lobs. Malik Renew had the post game, but Mackenzie Mbaka was still trying to come into his own, and there was really no outside presence. No one, I guess, capable of really consistently putting the ball on the floor and scoring on the perimeter. And you have that this year. You have Miles Rice, a guy who's done it. I know Cannon Carlisle, he has struggled big time. He missed the last 2 games with injury, but he's someone we've seen do it at Stanford. And then Mackenzie Mbako has taken a big step in his ability to catch it on the perimeter, take one dribble, hit a tough pull up, or just hit stuff in the mid range and make him even more difficult to defend than he already is. But again, this team's only going to keep getting better as long as they're able to stay healthy because it's finding that chemistry. I mean, Ant Wright had a good post, I think, talking about Miles Rice compared to Washington State versus this year. And it's Rice was playing a lot more free there, was not thinking as much. And it kind of feels like he's still trying to find his fit within the team. Versus last year, Washington State, it was a lot of the fit was around him. So it's finding that balance for him is going to be big moving forward.
And maybe that's part of the issue. It does kind of feel like the way that Indiana plays. There's a lot of thinking involved with it sometimes. You're trying to figure out how to get the ball down low to Umar Ballo or Malik Renew and kind of work your way into the paint. And maybe that sounds like it shouldn't require a lot of thinking, but whenever the offense, kind of plays that way and they look stagnant at times, it can definitely be easy to get in your head. And I think that's part of what we saw down in the Bahamas, especially when you're playing higher caliber competition and they're rolling and you're not. It's very easy to get caught up in some of the issues that you're facing. But Indiana will continue their non-conference slate this Friday, of course, against Miami of Ohio. Not their final tune-up game of the season, but they will take a break from non-conference play as they enter Big Ten play against Minnesota and then Nebraska on the road next week. I guess last question I'll ask about Indiana. What do you expect Indiana to look like coming out of those 2 games? You think they'll be 1-1, 2-0, 0-2? What do you foresee happening?
I think they're going to be. I think Minnesota is the team they should take care of. I think they're a better team than Minnesota. I think Nebraska is a tougher one, just on the road. Nebraska is a better team than people think.
Well, it feels like they've had Indiana's number for the last couple of years as well.
Exactly. And Connor Asegian, guy Indiana really looked at in the portal.
Very
He's
true.
been big off the bench for them. It's going to be one of those games that Indiana has the talent advantage, which they're going to have in a lot of these games. But are they going to be ready to play, I guess? Because you look at the team, the rebounding, for example, it's been an issue all year. Even going back to last year, despite Indiana having one of the biggest lineups in college basketball. And that goes back to mentality, the truth, to be honest. And they got to have the right mentality coming into these games.
Yeah, those 2 games next week will be big. I don't think Indiana has to go 2-0. It would definitely a win at Nebraska would make up at least partially for one of your blowout losses on the road. And because Indiana's going to have to find a way to win road games this year because as we mentioned before, not a lot on your non-conference schedule to really boost your resume. You're going to have to do some things in Big Ten play to help make sure that you do enough to get in the NCAA tournament. So we'll talk more Indiana basketball later. But for now, I want to transition to Mr. Drew Rosenberg's bread and butter, so to speak, and that is the National Basketball Association. And I do want to start, before we kind of get into some general stuff, I do want to start with the Indiana Pacers. What the hell's going on with the Indiana Pacers? They're coming off of one of the better postseason runs that they'd had in recent memory, at least since the Paul George days. And they've began this season, 9 wins, 13 losses. What do you think's kind of been the primary catalyst for this disappointing start for the Pacers?
I kind of look at 2 areas. I think the start, it's Tyrese Halliburton has not been great. I mean, you look at the numbers, he's averaging 17, 8.5, and 17.5 points, 8.5 assists. Both are lows since he joined the Pacers. But that's not the real issue. He's shooting a career low 34% from 3, 41.6 from the field. Like, those are numbers that, Halliburton's not the best scorer. He's not the guy that's going to come in. He can and has that capability, but he's not a guy that's going to consistently create tough shots for himself and make them. He's best when he's getting out in the open floor and really looking for his teammates and getting those assist numbers up. And that's been really a struggle for him this year. Just finding that balance for Halliburton. And he's, the anchor of that team. He's the engine of their offense and what they want to do. So it starts with him, and then defensively, go back to last year. They were not a good defensive team last year. And it was part of how they wanted to play. They wanted to play fast, and they wanted to outscore you. And it's why they were one of the toughest, matchups in the playoffs. It's why a team like the Knicks was a very good defensive team, struggled against them. It's why the Celtics, although it was a sweep, it was probably the closest series they played with the Celtics, all 3 of the 4 games being very close. So that balance of them not really being as good in transition, plus Halliburton struggling, and then the defense kind of staying around the same, made it tough for them.
Do you think Tyrese Halliburton is shouldering too much? Because after a run like they went on, I could see where if you're somebody like him who's still young in the league, and then you've kind of become this superstar of sorts. I mean, you're not like, somebody you're not like LeBron James, and nobody is. You're not a Steph Curry. You're not that type of player, but you are somebody who's kind of had this somewhat meteoric rise in the last couple of years. With that comes expectations. Do you think maybe that this is just kind of a slump for him, having to readjust and, kind of get back to basics for himself?
Yeah, I think so. I think, last year he was, a special player, again, considered one of the best point guards in the league. He was kind of thrown into that conversation of like on the edge of superstardom. And, it's one of those things that that pressure can get to the player. It's finding his rhythm and getting back to what he does best, because they have a talented roster. There's still some holes defensively that kind of need to be adjusted. But for the most part, the Pacers should be better than this. But a big reason, I guess, for their struggles early in the year is also the East has gotten better. The East has gone a lot healthier. Teams like the Orlando Magic, even with Paulo Banchero being out, have taken a step. The Knicks are a lot are better, even if their record doesn't show it. And then you have a team like Cleveland, who is 19-3, best record in the NBA right now, who, they didn't really make any changes other than a new head coach, Kenny Atkinson, who's kind of, rejuvenated that team. And when you have those other teams getting better, the Pacers didn't really, I guess their big addition was Ben Mathurin getting healthy. It kind of all adds up to, a team maybe taking a step back. And that's kind of what we've seen so far.
If you were projecting where this team would be when it comes to making the playoffs or not by the end of the season, at least from this point in the season, where do you think they'd end up?
I think they're going to be kind of right on the verge of the play-in, or just out. Like they're either going to be like, I could see them as the 6 through 10, that kind of range. They're either going to just avoid the play-in or be in the play-in. But the thing is, in the East, we've seen it. Just because you're a play-in team doesn't mean you can make a run. The Indiana Pacers are a tough team to beat, even if, despite being 9-13 on the year, they've lost some bad games. But when the Pacers are hitting shots, they're one of the hardest teams to beat in the league. And we've seen the Heat make a run to the finals from that play-in spot. So the truth is, they can be one of the most dangerous teams, especially near early round of the playoffs.
And moving on to some of the more bigger picture stuff, what has kind of been maybe the biggest story or maybe biggest surprise for you so far this NBA season?
I'm going to go my favorite story, which is the Houston Rockets right now. You look at Houston, they didn't really make major changes this offseason, but Ime Udoka in his second year, who is, one of the best coaches in the league, probably have an NBA championship right now if he didn't have some, off the court issues that cost him, the Boston Celtics job. But his job, he's done an incredible job. The Rockets, they play tough defense. They're one of the most, talented teams, and they built it the right way. There's been the talks of them potentially trying to trade for a star. But if I'm them, why would you trade for a star when you have Jalen Green playing some of the best basketball of his career? And then one of my favorite players in the NBA, Alperen Sengun, who, if you have not watched him, he is box office. He doesn't have the name yet. He's a foreign guy. But currently, right now in the year, averaging 19, 11, 5 assists and a block a game. He's a 7-footer. He's like a smaller version of Jokic. He's not as big physically, but plays very similar. And he's that point center that, is starting to kind of filter into the NBA. And it's become one of my favorite players to watch in the league as a result.
One thing that's been intriguing the last couple of years is this NBA Cup. And I haven't watched a ton of it, but one thing that, and again, this is, first of all, just a very small thing. The colored floors, I hate it. I can't deal with watching it. And I don't know if you're a fan of that. And I know that's kind of just been the way of the NBA. Like I remember the NBA All-Star game last year. I mean, it wasn't even about the game. It was about the aesthetics. It was one of the coolest, weirdest looking floors in history. And again, this is not the exact same thing, but we've been seeing very weird courts in the NBA and somewhat in college basketball for several years now. But it's just been, it was a very weird thing to watch, especially during Thanksgiving holidays.
Yeah, I get what they're trying to do, and I like, the idea behind it of, changing the court so people recognize, oh, this game matters for something else too. It's a little different. But I don't know if you watched the Nuggets game last night versus, I think it was the Warriors. That was one of the ugliest courts I've ever seen. It was yellow. There's a clip of it. You can see the reflection of the court like bouncing off Steve Kerr's face in the lighting. I think the courts, some of them are, okay, but I think it's terrible. And the one thing that really bothers me about it is they won't do it for the NBA Finals. I'm not asking for that big court, but I don't know if you remember in like the late 2000, like 2008, 2007, around that time, NBA Finals teams, they'd have the big Larry O'Brien trophy in the center of the court with the logo. And it was one of, just like the nostalgia of it was cool, but also it was like, all right, this is the big time. They changed the court a little bit. There's no need to go the full changes, have the little NBA Cup emblem or something like that. But the full, green courts or the yellow, bright yellow courts is just not it for me.
Do you think the NBA Cup in general is something that has helped the NBA overall during this time of year? Because obviously we know football is king, especially the NFL, and competing with the NBA pretty much up until the NFL is over. It seems like there's a lot of the general sports population, unless your local team is really good. I feel like it's tough to really go full all in into the NBA until after the Super Bowl is over. So do you think that this is added to the NBA season, or do you think it's just kind of a filler thing that doesn't really need to happen in order to, keep ratings up, if you will?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's definitely added something. I mean, we've seen the competitiveness of these games. It's a little different. And it's also fun to see that kind of European style of scored point differential matters. And because that's not something that, ever matters in the NBA over an 82 game season. But you see a team like, for example, last night, the Boston Celtics, that's my team. They were eliminated from the NBA Cup without playing. They needed either the Knicks to lose or win by 30 something points. Like, it's fun to see the point differential matters, and you see teams playing their stars, even in blowouts to the final minutes, because they know they need to score and get a big enough lead. And the fans, it's, kind of iffy right now on how they care, but I feel like, especially, I remember last year, Pacers-Lakers, I was in Bloomington for it. Upstairs pub was completely packed as everyone was going crazy for that game. So people do care once you're kind of into the playoff of it. And I think as the years go on and there's kind of more history behind it, and there's more moments that are like, oh, that was a special moment, more people are going to get more involved and more interested in it. It's only going to help grow the NBA.
That's true. The more you do it, the more people will be aware of it. And that's always, exposure, no matter what type of exposure it is always, for the most part, good exposure, right? And then one more thing. Who do you think's been the biggest standout rookie so far in the league?
I think it's Jared McCain. I don't think there's any other answer at the moment. Zach Edey's, guys have had their moments. Zach Edey's been good, but Jared McCain, what he's done for Philly, I know they've struggled, but he's come in and looks like his game fits the NBA better than college. And he was a very good college player. Averaging 16 a game right now, is the runaway favorite shooting for rookie of the year at the moment. I think just under 38% from three, 90% from the free throw line. McCain is a guy, you saw it. We talked about this draft, the big time is like maybe not the superstars, but a bunch of guys who could make their place in the NBA and have that role. And Jared McCain is, the perfect example. He might never be a 30-point per game scorer, best player in the league, MVP type guy, but he is someone who's going to have a long career because he can shoot the three ball at a high level. And as we both know, if you can do that, you have a role in the NBA.
Yeah. Drew Rosenberg from HoosierIllustrated.com, talking all things Indiana basketball and, of course, the NBA, as we just did. What's coming up next for you? More so, are y'all is talking about the Hoosiers coming out this week, or you got anything interesting coming out for the website?
Yeah, talking about the Hoosiers coming out tomorrow. Full coverage of everything. We'll have the coverage of basketball game against Miami on Friday. All the playoff news that kind of comes for Indiana football, and
Indiana football early signing day was today, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes.
I haven't mentioned that much on today's show, and I'm probably going to save most of that for Friday, just so I can get a full kind of look at who's going to be coming in next year for the Hoosiers. But another exciting thing going on, for a lot of good stuff going on with Indiana sports in general, right?
Yep, as always. Or maybe not as always, but as of right now at the moment.
As of right now, it's been a good end of the calendar year. Hopefully we go into 2025 with a lot of momentum, and I'm excited. I'm ready to get into some more football talk right now. Oh, I don't know if you can hear my phone alarm going off, but it is doing just that. And that means it's time to go. It's time for you to go, Drew. But I appreciate your time as always. Be sure to check out Talking About the Hoosiers tomorrow right here on Hoosier Illustrated. If you're not subscribed and if you haven't hit that notifications bell, do so right now. You'll know when this is published. You'll know when their shows are published. All the good stuff we have going on each and every day. And Drew, look forward to talking with you again some other time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John. It's always a pleasure.
Good stuff from Drew Rosenberg. Appreciate having him back on the show. And again, like we said, going to try to do some more frequent updates, especially as we get into full-blown basketball season. I know the NFL will be going on for quite a bit longer as well. And we don't really track the NFL. Same with the NBA. The way that we track IU and the college landscape of things, but I definitely want to check in with Drew Rosenberg a little more often if I'm able to make that work. So a few more things I want to get into before we wrap up a Wednesday edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports. And I'm going to start with the newly updated penultimate, as I mentioned earlier, college football playoff rankings, where the Hoosiers ended up, where everybody else ended up. Talk about the rankings, talk about the bracket, just kind of give you my thoughts on what I think the committee has done. If it's good, if it's bad, if it's in between, it's probably going to be a little bit of in between, right? That's how it should be as well. So without further ado, let's take a look at these rankings. And this isn't the first time I've looked at them. It does. I can see why you might think it is, because it seems like I'm beating it around the bush. I'm just pulling up my poll to reference in my bracket, because the thing with the rankings and the bracket, of course, is it's not always going to align with what the rankings say. So we'll go ahead and go from 1 to 12. Of course, Oregon, they're still the lone unbeaten at this point in the college football season. Going to try to keep that record, of course, unbeaten against Penn State. And they will otherwise be the 1 seed. And if they lose, they'll drop more than likely just to the 5, being that would be their only loss and be coming off a perfect record. So Oregon will likely either stay at their 1 spot, or if Penn State beats them, they will be at the 5. And honestly, that's probably what this ranking will end up being, right? Because if Penn State knocks off the lone unbeaten team in the country, especially with them being number 3, I don't see any reason to think that Penn State might not be the number 1 overall seed, which is wild to think about, considering that they didn't beat Ohio State at home and they only lost by 7, but many people watched that game and thought that maybe Penn State was quite outmatched in that. And I would disagree to go that far, but it would be wild to see Penn State upset Oregon and claim that number 1 spot, and of course the bye. So again, how the bracket works there: Oregon will get the bye and face the 8-9 winner, which at the moment is Tennessee and Ohio State. And again, we'll get to their subsequent rankings here in a bit. And then Texas currently holds the number 2 seed, the 2 seed and the number 2 ranking. And they would play the winner of, there you go, the Indiana Hoosiers and Georgia. Again, we'll get to the matchups and things, my thoughts on that here in a bit. And then, as I mentioned, currently, because Penn State is number 3, they do not get a bye because of the conference stuff. So they automatically get the 5. They would host Arizona State and would move on to face Boise State. Again, and probably one of the best brackets you could be in, at least from a on paper standpoint. And then moving further along after that, Notre Dame number 4, but they, due to all this moving around and, things, you get bumped back a little bit due to, first of all, Notre Dame not having a conference championship. And then whenever the other teams are ahead, you get bumped back even further. So Notre Dame, number 4 ranked team, but overall the number 6 seed, hosting Alabama in this particular edition. And here's the one that we know, when Ward Manuel was speaking with to the ESPN crew, and I guess to the nation, if you will, about what things will look like for the final college football playoff rankings. They said they're not going to adjust, teams that aren't playing in the college football playoff, that aren't playing in the conference championship games. And so as it currently stands, because of Notre Dame and Alabama, they will not be playing in conference championship games. Does that mean that matchup is solidified? I know it would sound like that would be the case. But if other teams lose and other teams, find themselves in, I don't think that necessarily means that that's what's going to happen. I think it's easy to interpret it that way, but there's so many things. Like if we're looking at teams that are in the college football playoff rankings, and I realize I've just kind of derailed from going over the rankings themselves, and I think that's probably fine. If you want to look at the exact rankings of everybody, feel free to do that. And I know I've already mentioned it. Indiana's the 10 seed. They fell as or they come in as the ninth ranked team, but because again of auto bids and that sort of stuff, they're actually the 10 seed and will be hosted by the Georgia Bulldogs in their opening round matchup if this holds. But I don't think a lot of this will hold. And you won't, whenever they say that teams won't move, it means they won't move on their own accord because of certain things that happen in the different championship games. So we'll have Georgia versus Texas in the SEC championship. And that, back to what I was saying about whether or not it's going to matter, like if a certain result happens, will it fluctuate who went, where teams go? I think if Georgia beats Texas, I think there's a good chance you may just see them switch spots and have Texas go down to the 7, Georgia getting the auto bid at maybe the 2. Again, a lot of different things could play out. Maybe SMU wins and they move up to the 2, considering they only have one loss and that sort of thing. Maybe the SEC team becomes the 3 seed when it comes to the buys. Of course, that remains to be seen. But if Georgia loses, they'll still be in the college football playoff, I would say, no doubt at this point. But I don't think that they would be the team that's hosting Indiana, because if I'm going back to references, let's just theoretically say Georgia loses to Texas, because they won't be favored in that game, I wouldn't think. I haven't looked at it. If there's a spread out for it, maybe the odds makers would beg to differ on that. But if Georgia loses, depending on the style of the loss, let's just say they lose by 10 points or something to Texas, I bet they would drop at least a spot. They drop below Ohio State, maybe below Tennessee. I don't know, maybe just a spot. Because again, it would probably depend on the competitiveness of the SEC championship game. But regardless, you're not necessarily going to see this won't necessarily be the matchup that you get 100% whenever the final rankings come out. Because if Georgia loses, that potentially moves Ohio State up to that 6 seed. And that would, of course, bring I guess it'd be the 7 seed, excuse me. Or hold on, because the way now I'm looking at this very weird with Ohio State is above Tennessee. Okay, I think what happened is the bracket that I'm looking at is not the. Am I looking at the wrong bracket? I don't think I am. I'm worried that I'm looking at the wrong bracket. I know Indiana is with Georgia, but maybe the bracket just has Ohio State and Tennessee mixed up, because in the bracket I'm looking at, it shows Ohio State going on the road to Tennessee, and it would be the opposite. Ohio State would be hosting Tennessee. But if Georgia were to lose and that, bumps things over a little bit, then maybe you see Indiana having a rematch with the Buckeyes. And like you heard Mitchell Page talk about earlier, that could provide, even though maybe it wouldn't be something that fans would enjoy to see a second time. I mean, if you were to get your revenge on them and beat them, that would be enjoyable. But you heard Mitchell say he heard some players the other day talking about how they want another rematch with Ohio State. And so that would be interesting to see. It'd be unfortunate that it would be back in Columbus and not in Bloomington, just to have a different venue, but it'd be a shot at redemption, right? And I think you would get Indiana's best shot a second time. And especially after what happened with Ohio State against Michigan. I mean, we don't necessarily understand it as Indiana fans, but like the Ohio State-Michigan game makes or breaks your season, no matter how good of a year you've had. And to see some of the reaction that has come from the way Ohio State lost that game, and then you factor in all of the nonsense with the fighting at midfield and the flag planting and that type of stuff. I mean, it's going to take a bit for Ohio State to get that taste out of their mouth, right? And if they're, I mean, they're not playing in the Big Ten championship game, of course, and so they're waiting. I mean, their very next game may be against Indiana, or again in its current state, Tennessee, and so we very may well see Indiana get a shot at I don't want to say a deflated Buckeyes team, but maybe that's what it would be. But they'd be looking to find their footing again, as Indiana has already done so, completely dismantling their rival in Purdue 66-0, and wanting a shot, players wanting a shot back at the Buckeyes. And I think that would go a long way. I mean, again, the redemption of the, we talked about the triangle. I don't know if it was the triangle of hate or what the phrasing somebody used was, but, Purdue, Michigan, Ohio State, of course, the teams that Curt Cignetti mentioned during his introduction into Assembly Hall. The fact that you didn't complete that in the regular season and getting a second shot at that in the college football playoff, there is a high level of intrigue there, even though it would still be fun to see Indiana go on the road and face a team that's not only somebody you haven't played, but a team from a different conference. The teams that are currently hosting in this are Ohio State, Penn State, Notre Dame, and Georgia. Of course, two of those Big Ten teams. One of them, a team you haven't played with, Penn State. So there is intrigue with that because of Tom Allen. And that also could potentially be Oregon in that slot if Penn State ends up defeating Oregon, as we talked about earlier. And then Notre Dame, the in-state matchup that, of course, there's so many different storylines you could create based on who Indiana travels to play. And, of course, with the current iteration where you travel to Georgia, you have one of the whiniest coaches in the SEC in Kirby Smart that tries to create, and he's not the only one. Him and Lane Kiffin have been doing the same thing all year long, where they act like, oh my God, the SEC is so hard. Please let us in the college football playoff, please. To see Indiana, and Curt Cignetti is the exact opposite, at least when it comes to the way that he presents himself. To see Indiana go down and beat a whiny SEC team, to then potentially go on and face another SEC team. I mean, imagine this. I mean, again, we're just talking theoreticals here now, right? Indiana potentially plays both SEC championship participants, with Georgia and Texas following if you defeat Georgia. You knock out both of those, man, the SEC will be beside themselves. They wouldn't know how to handle. Not only did you not make any noise in the playoff from your two highest rated teams, but you lost to an upstart Indiana team that many in the SEC, whether it be coaches or pundits, whatever it may be, they think you're fraudulent. And again, maybe Indiana is fraudulent. That's why we're just talking what ifs here right now. And I'm sure the Ohio State fans would love that. They were all in the comments a few weeks ago talking about all of the what ifs I was talking about with their game. They showed their ass, not only with Indiana, but with the way they reacted after losing to Michigan as well. They think they're so high and mighty. They treat themselves like they are just like an SEC fan base. And again, they're a great fan base. They're a large fan base, one of the best in college football, just in terms of numbers alone. But just show some self-respect, right? And now I've gone off into a tangent that I didn't necessarily want to go down. But let me finish my thought on this potential road that's currently set before Indiana with this specific iteration of the rankings. You play Georgia. If you win, you play Texas. There is an outside scenario where Alabama advances twice, and then you face a third straight SEC team in a row. And that, for that matter, your former offensive coordinator in Kalen DeBoer. Indiana would, without a doubt, be earning their spot in the championship if that ended up being their path. And they won all those games. Again, I know it sounds a little insane that I'm even saying what if Indiana wins, but it really shouldn't be. I think I'd like to get rid of this mindset. I think most of it is gone because I'm talking about these scenarios like they are realistic, but I don't like thinking, is this crazy? Because a couple of months ago, it did sound a little bit crazy because we had never seen Indiana handle success in a good way. And now we've seen them win two more games than they ever had in any regular season ever to have an 11-1 season. And now they're going to be participants in the 12-team college football playoff with a shot at some of the biggest names, biggest brands, I should say, in college sports, in college football as well, whatever it may be. I mean, you have a chance. Indiana, no matter who they play, Indiana's going to have a chance to make their mark on the, what the future will look like, not only for them, but expectations, for teams that are trying to replicate that type of season. I mean, Indiana has laid a foundation and a blueprint for other programs to potentially follow if they have the coaching staff and the personnel to do so. And I mean, we're talking again. I know I've said this a lot, but could you imagine of showing any of this to somebody who was an Indiana fan? And this will bring me into a YouTube comment here in a moment. Showing any of this to an Indiana fan back in the early August, mid-August, whatever, maybe before they played a game. I mean, it's just crazy. I know I sound like a broken record, but that's just where we're at. So hopefully I articulated most of that pretty well. I know I kind of went down a bunch of different branching pathways, it felt like, as I was going over some of those rankings. But that's where we're at. I want to get to a couple of YouTube comments, and then we'll wrap up today's edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports. And I want to start with one that I kind of alluded to here a moment ago. And it was from our friend Justin Beard. He says, "Now don't act like I didn't call the hotline before the season started and predicted IU's success. Well, I said Cignetti would win the Big Ten. Came a little short of that, unfortunately, but close enough." Justin, if you truly believe that, and I think all of us thought, like, okay, it'd be awesome if that happens. But to me, I mean, I was always a wait and see kind of. I mean, I predicted an 8-4 season, which of course is not enough to win a Big Ten title. But Justin, props to you if you truly believed that Indiana was going to be, win the Big Ten championship. And, you aren't far off. So I'm sure you are one of very few, if any, that believe that was a, not even a realistic possibility, but like, you expected that to happen. I think there's two different things. Like, is that a possibility? And Indiana should do this. I don't think there was anybody that's saying Indiana should go win the Big Ten championship in year one without seeing them play a single snap. Maybe I'm wrong, though. But saying that they could get to the Big Ten championship because they have a favorable schedule and all this stuff that Cignetti's saying, if it comes true, then maybe they can do that. Then that's a little bit more of a believable thing to I guess, swallow or understand, right? So, but shout out to you, Mr. Beard, for doing that. A couple more comments. Mike Shenefield says, "I totally agree." This is back from whenever we had Derek Jackson on not too long ago. He said, "I totally agree with Derek Jackson on what I call this for Indiana football, them not going to be a one-hit wonder." And that's going to be something that we talk, of course, a little bit more into the offseason, just because there are so many different things that no matter what happens in the college football playoff that are going to be different going into next year, because I would be very surprised. And I know Indiana's budget for assistants and stuff has gone up, but I would be very surprised if guys like Mike Shanahan and Brian Haynes are still in their current positions with Indiana football next season. And I always throw Tino Sinceri in there as well. And you could even throw any of the other position coaches. Anytime you're any sort of coach on a winning staff, there's going to be somebody that tries to offer you a little bit more money at potentially a bigger program. And that will mean Curt Cignetti's got to go dig in, not only for a new roster, but new staff. And he's had this staff with him for a very long time. I don't know how many of them have been from one regime to the next or one school to the next, but I do know Brian Haynes and Shanahan and Tino Sinceri. I believe all three of them have been around for quite some time. And I do think that's a big reason for why things came together so easily and quickly this year. And it's going to be difficult to find, just the right, to replicate this exactly right. Because when you're so used to, bringing your guys along for the ride for a year in and year out, school after school, and you all have a way in doing things, and you mesh well together, and there's chemistry. Like, that is not easy to replicate. I don't care how good of a coach you are, right? And so whoever Cignetti ends up deciding to put in those positions, if they open up, that's going to be probably a big part in Indiana's success next season and how successful they can be. Now, do I believe in Cignetti's ability to find the right guy who will fit what he wants to do? Yes. But sometimes you hire someone and they're not what they thought they would be. And that goes for any job, not just, coaching college football. And then the next part of that is finding guys in the transfer portal that fit what you want to do. It was easy for him last year to be like, you know what, I'm going to bring in X amount of JMU guys because I know what they are capable of doing, and I've seen them do this for a long time now, and I think this will translate to the Power 4 level. Now, you can still do that, of course, find some of the best of the G5 and even some of the lower power programs and pick the best contributors from there. But when you haven't coached them now, it's more of a risk because you're going to need to build that relationship from the ground up. He knew a lot of these guys that were coming from JMU before they even got to IU's campus because he coached them, of course. And so those are going to be two things that are really defining the new foundation for next year when Indiana is trying to, at least in some way, shape, or form, replicate this successful season. Now, I don't think Indiana needs to go out and win 10, 11 games every year to be successful with Curt Cignetti. But what I do think Indiana can be now is something of an Iowa, and I use that comparison a lot. I've always wanted Indiana to kind of at least, I don't want them to play the boring offense that Iowa plays, but I've wanted them to have that same level of consistency. Because Iowa, they're not contending for the college football playoff every year. They've had years where they are doing that, and they come very close to doing so. But Iowa, it seems like they're always an 8, 9, fringe 10-win team. And in special seasons, maybe more than that. And I think if Indiana under Curt Cignetti, if 8 wins can be the floor, and again, this sounds like crazy talk because 8 wins used to be the ceiling for an Indiana football team, right? If 8 wins can be kind of your floor for a good season, then you're making it, right? Curt Cignetti's a made man in Indiana. And I think, I do think that he'll figure out what to do to be able to replicate that. But again, it'll still next year, if Indiana's 8-4 next year, based on what's happened this season, I think that will be considered, at least in some way, shape, or form, a disappointment. It depends on who those 8 wins are against, of course, who the 4 losses would be against. And I know I'm getting way ahead of myself, but it is something we're going to have to think about, especially once the season is officially over and the postseason's done. And we really see if guys like Shanahan and Haynes move on, and if any other key players jump into the transfer portal that maybe you thought were going to stick around or go to the NFL draft. Guys like Aiden Fisher, he has one more year of eligibility. I don't think, based on what we know of him and his personality, I don't think he would jump in the transfer portal, but it wouldn't surprise me if he wants to test the NFL waters and maybe even go ahead and fully jump into the NFL draft, especially after the success you've had this year. You'll never get this. I doubt Indiana football ever gets this level of attention again unless they are having an even better season, right? Maybe they go 11-1, but they had a tougher schedule and you knocked off a couple of ranked opponents. That would give you the same level of attention, if not more, next year or in subsequent seasons. So, long-winded way in answering your question, or, not, it wasn't even really a question, just commenting on your comment, the one-hit wonder stuff. And then lastly, Kevin and an Agent All-Star. Kevin Casey and Agent All-Star both kind of said the same thing, or in different ways. One of them commented and the other one responded. And I wanted to kind of address this as well, because I don't think let me just read the comment and then I'll share my thoughts. Kevin says, I have to disagree. The games I've watched, the Big Ten this year, will be better than last year. We won't finish higher than 8th, in my honest opinion. And he's talking about whenever I made a comment last week saying that I think Indiana needs to run the table because the Big Ten is not as strong as they were several years ago. And let me go and read the second comment. Agent All-Star said, I was thinking the same thing. Rutgers, Purdue, Illinois look very good among others. Iowa plays like Louisville, and I don't see any easy wins. And that's probably true to some extent. I do think you guys are right when it comes to, yes, last year to this year, for sure, the Big Ten probably has some more serious contenders than we may realize. And honestly, sometimes it's hard to remember, at least for some reason in basketball, that you're going to be facing Oregon Washington, USC, and UCLA. And UCLA had some high projections coming into this year. And am I looking at the right thing? Now I'm questioning myself again with I feel like I'm looking at the wrong thing. But you have 3 teams in the top 12, and then you can throw Illinois in there as well. Had a big win over Arkansas. And I don't know how good Arkansas under John Calipari is going to end up being, but I mean, Brad Underwood really looked like the better coach in that game. It seems like Calipari is very stubborn, like just like Mike Woodson in different ways. Of course, John Calipari has a lot more success to show for, at least at the college level. But to see him just up and bring his system to Fayetteville, and I believe they took another loss last night. I don't have it right in front of me, but Arkansas and John Calipari. I saw my buddy Nick, who he had on the show, of course, last week. He believes that John Calipari is going to fade into oblivion or to irrelevance while he's at Arkansas. And right now, that may end up being the case. Yeah, Indiana, there's not. Maybe we'll do a deep dive into this either tomorrow or Friday or next week. I do want to look more closely at some of the teams in the conference because, as I mentioned before, I haven't done the deep dives into some of these Big Ten teams the way that I had with football because there's been so much football going on. But now I've got to really turn my attention into both of them, especially now that football's got a bit of a break. We're going to be doing a little more basketball-focused shows for the next couple of weeks until Indiana football's back in action for the college football playoff. Now we'll have things to react to football-wise. I mentioned earlier on Friday we'll talk about signing day and that type of stuff, and who's going to be some impact players for the future of Indiana football for the freshmen, and all that kind of stuff. So I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's episode. Been a good episode. And hope you guys enjoyed it as well. And look at me patting myself on the back. It was a good episode. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully you thought it was good. If not, I'll try to make it better on Friday. Again, appreciate Drew for coming on today, talking some basketball, college and pro. And on Friday, I believe we're going to talk to Alec Lasley about some, all things IU, Indiana football, basketball, get thoughts on things that have been going on the last couple of days. And we'll preview the next Indiana game against Miami of Ohio a little bit as well. So until Friday, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.